Great. So thank you so much to our panel. It was a great kickoff to starting to think about the working group. So what I'm going to be doing is to be trying to provide a little bit of framing to kind of level set and help us really think about, how did we get here in thinking about the next generation indicators, providing a couple of examples from my organization, the Consortium on School Research, that we've been doing to think about some of these next generation indicators, and then taking some of the lessons that we have from work that we've been doing in Chicago around the freshman on track indicator and how that might be applied as we're trying to decide what's the right way to go in terms of indicators. And then finally, there's going to be some time for you to be engaging in this question. So each table has been assigned a type of indicator, and I'm going to be asking you to kind of be going through a series of questions so we can start to think, like, where are we in terms of the evidence base or what we know how to addressing these indicators, what the state of the data systems are. And so we can start to prioritize what should we be thinking about with this working group going forward to really be making a lot of progress in trying to bring together all the different types of indicator options that we have out there. So I was going to start off. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work and a lot of thinking over time around academic performance, right? So we have the ABCs, we've got a really strong evidence base. We think a lot about how this relates to educational attainment. So this is kind of like the known part of the early warning indicators early warning and response systems. But one of the things that we are starting to realize is that it's not useful to be thinking about academic performance in isolation, right? I mean, we can be thinking about what the performance is of students, but I think as we've been doing this work and as we've really been seeing some progress in working around the academic performance and particularly educational attainment, I think the question that has kind of come up is, how do we actually improve on these? I think there's been some kind of technical solutions to improving attendance and improving grades, so we're able to get some progress in terms of better attendance and better grades. But really what we want is thinking about how do we actually promote greater learning so that students are ultimately successful in college and beyond. And part of it is also, I think, pushing us kind of to use Angela's ideas. It's not just about kids that we're trying to work on, but how do we actually start to engage people in thinking about what's happening at the school level or in the classroom level or at the system level. And it's not enough just to be looking at these outcomes of grades, attendance, and behaviors, but to really start to think about the underlying factors there. And so school climate surveys can tell us a lot about this. I'll be touching on this later, but it's some work that has been happening for a long time, but it's largely been disconnected from this idea of improving on student outcomes. And then, the topic that we heard about a lot today is around social and emotional learning. I think we've really, as we think about why is it that kids are performing poorly in their classrooms around grades, attendance, and behaviors, we've started to think about what's the role of social emotional learning and how are these really intimately tied to these other types of outcomes, and how is that also about what's going on inside of the classroom and the structures that we have created. And then there's health, which I think I was really excited when Delaney spoke today, because it's actually something that I was thinking a lot about, about 10, 15 years ago, and I feel like I sort of moved away from it and realizing that this is an area where there's actually a lot of evidence from, and we haven't really capitalized nearly enough in thinking about it and having a much more holistic view about the factors that go into school success, and that health plays a tremendous role. I think the greater attention that has been paid of late to equity and thinking about the role of trauma in school performance also comes into here, where we're starting to realize that we can't be having these siloed solutions, that if we really think about kids and what's going on in their lives as a whole at home and in the community and how all these factors come into play in terms of their performance in school, we can be much more effective in doing this. And we also are starting to have the data to be really addressing these issues. And then I have this like others category, in part because, I think especially I was really excited with the panel this morning about higher ed, and I think they're really pushing our thinking in the K-12 space about what the possibilities are, whether it's predictive analytics or just being much more strategic. So I think what's really great about the gathering today is how we can bring together the learnings from all these different sectors, because we are interested, we have a common goal, and we know a lot, and there's a lot of brain power in this room. But if we put it all together, we can actually come up with an idea about how do we actually use all the data that we have, all the knowledge we have, all that we know about interventions and support and building better systems that can really support students toward educational attainment. The other part I really also want to think a lot about too is, and it's kind of the title of our convening today, it's not about college and career readiness, which I think has been the big mantra. One of, I think, the really important shifts that we have seen that is happening more and more is people are talking about adult success. And certainly I think there is rightfully a lot of attention being paid to college and career success, and that's kind of front and center. But I think ultimately what we care about is not just that kids have a college degree and they've got a family-sustaining job, to use our vision statement, but also that they're actually leading the sorts of lives that they want to be living. That they're actually they have strong relationships, they have a place in their community, they've got that they're healthy, and there's all these other pieces of it that really, really matter, and these are part and parcel of it. And that, and some of this is thinking about, kids much more holistically. And I think as we think about kids more holistically, with all these different types of outcomes, and thinking about who they are, where they come from, who they might become, we can be much more effective in supporting them, as well as thinking about how all of these different systems can come together. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about work that we've been doing at the consortium. I've actually realized it's kind of silly for this to be calling it like next generation indicators, because this is actually research that goes back 20 years. So like about 4 years ago, Tony Bright and some of my colleagues from the consortium had this book on Organizing School for Improvement. It's based on survey data going back 20 years, really trying to understand what the factors are that go into improving schools. And it's thinking about schools as organizations. And I think one of the things that I'm really kind of excited about with this idea of next generation indicators is how it's bringing together a lot of different ideas, because to help students improve on attendance, behavior, and course grades, and to be improving on their educational attainment outcomes, we really need to be thinking about schools and the context that they're in, and that, are schools actually supporting students in ways that make them feel like they can be successful, that they belong in school, that's really paying attention to the types of people that students might become. And that we're also making sure that schools are organized in ways where teachers are collaborating with each other, that there's actually strong leadership with them. There's all these different factors that go into the ways that students are learning, and ultimately their outcomes in the long term. So actually, there was a question earlier about school climate surveys, and we've also touched a little bit on the accountability thing. So one of the things that the consortium has been doing for the past 25 years is administering these student and teacher surveys. And we've kind of had this interesting evolution on how the survey information has been given to schools. So we have been producing individual school reports for the past 25 years. So every single school who has a certain response level to our surveys gets a report on what those responses look like, so they know that. For a long time, this was information that was completely private for the schools. And so the idea was that schools needed information to help them improve. But about 7 or 8 years ago, this information went online and it became public. So this is this is kind of an example from one of our reports. It was done in a very visually appealing way. Anybody could go to the website, look up a school, and get a sense, get inside that black box of what's happening inside of schools. And then a couple of years ago, the school climate survey results actually became part of the school accountability system. So it's only a small part. For high schools, it's 5%. For elementary schools, it's 10% of their ultimate grade. But on the other hand, there's sort of this interesting question about how data is used and whether it's something that is completely private to the school, whether information is publicly available, and when there's actually start to be a certain amount of stakes attached to it that really sort of shift how we think about data and its uses in schools. That is, I think there are pluses and minuses to the accountability piece of this, and this is also something that's happening with the social emotional learning measures. That is both, it's a new frontier, and we don't know for sure what this means for how we think about how people are reporting on them, and also how they are ultimately used. And there are pluses and minuses on both sides with that. Another survey or another framework that we've done is we have our non-cognitive. I feel like there's we haven't gone into the nomenclature wars around this stuff, but social emotional learning, non-cognitive factors, metacognitive factors. Broadly, we're talking about the same general set of things. So in 2012, Camille Farrington is one of my colleagues at the consortium, and some other of us put together a framework to think about it. So there are a lot of frameworks out there around non-cognitive factors, but I think one of the things that's really important how we think about it is that while we want to identify the non-cognitive factors, we also really want to be situating this in the classroom context. And we don't think of these factors as being just ways of thinking about what a kid characteristic, but are we actually creating the sorts of environments that support students in ways that they are doing things like displaying tenacity or feeling like a sense of self-efficacy? Or are they developing the sorts of learning strategies that ultimately help them be successful in school? So I think this is another way in which this next generation of indicators is really pushing much more directly on the levers of saying, these are not just measures of student performance, but we really need to be starting to understand what's happening with adults in the building, what's happening across the entire system, to be really making sure that student outcomes improve and that ultimately they are successful in college and career and life. Camille Farrington also developed a student survey and a teacher survey to be measuring these factors, and these are all done around the kid perspective of what's happening in a given classroom. So we're thinking about not just do you feel a sense of belonging in general, but do you feel a sense of belonging in your algebra classroom? And so it really is sort of trying to get at the idea that these are not kid characteristics, but these are things that adults should be trying to do to develop the sort of environments that are really supportive of students around these things. So I'm going to be going, hopefully fairly quickly, because I want to make sure that we have some time for table talk, about some of the lessons that we've learned over time about what makes for an effective indicator. And this is, initially this framework was done through the Chris Partners project. And so as with Angela mentioned earlier, we were working with, the consortium was working with the Annenberg Institute and the John Gardner Center. And one of the things we really wanted to think about is what makes for an effective indicator. And so another theme of today is that a lot of these things are not just about, that these are both technical solutions and human solutions. So when I think about an effective indicator, I don't just think about the statistical properties of an indicator, but we really need to think about how these indicators are being used and how they are connected to a system of supports. And so it really kind of, I think, reshapes a little bit about how we think about how we choose what our indicators should be. So we started off with this idea of an effective indicator really has to be centered around a problem or an issue that is considered to be a priority and that there's actually leadership behind it. And I think that was one of the things that was really striking this morning when we were hearing about all the work that was happening in the higher ed institutions, is that there was this real sense that student success mattered, and there was some leadership behind it, and there was organization around it. And so it wasn't just these isolated things. I think without really people having a common goal around this, these efforts are not going to be successful. So an indicator, yes, it's a piece of measurement, but it's really embedded in these larger efforts, and to make them be effective, we need to make sure that this is something that is shared across the system. So for the on-track indicator, it was actually stated in the priorities, so the freshman on-track indicator was actually stated as part of the priorities of the district in their ed plan, and so it was kind of known that high school graduation mattered. Another really important part of this is actually the statistical properties of it, that you want to make sure that your indicator is predictive of the outcome of interest. So in the case of on track, early on some research at the consortium, we saw that students who were on track at the end of freshman year were 4 times more likely to graduate from high school than students who were off track. And this is above and beyond incoming test scores, demographics on this, so we really kind of knew that there was this strong predictive relationship between being on track at the end of freshman year and whether or not students graduate from high school. And I probably should mention real quickly that a student is considered to be on track at the end of freshman year if they have enough credits to be promoted to be a sophomore and they have no more than 1 semester F. So it's really about course failures and how that closely is related to high school graduation. So another really important piece about thinking about what makes for an effective indicator is the fact that it's malleable. Actually, Delaney, you mentioned this too, right? It's something that you can actually change and that we actually know how to change it. And so part of the indicators, what makes for an effective indicator is that that it's actually known on the ground what can be done to act on it. So it's something that's really actionable and that their strategies around this are known and that there's actually larger support around it in the school and across the system to make sure that there can be movement on that indicator. So in Chicago, around the freshman on track indicator, the district had these efforts, and actually there was an effort that was funded by the Gates Foundation where there were 5 freshmen on track labs in high schools that were really developing strategies. And there's the work of the network for our partner at the University of Chicago, the Network for College Success, which was really trying to help schools engage in the idea of how do you work on freshmen on track, support students in the transition to high school, so that there is improvements. There's actually started to be known strategies around how to do this, how to be supporting students in the freshman year. So finally, there's this data component of it. There's a lot of times there's data that's available on a yearly basis, but for early warning indicators and for data to become really actionable, it needs to be available to practitioners in a timely fashion so they can actually be doing something about it. So with the on-track indicator, there was a district early warning system that had a roster of all freshman students, and it was showing who was passing their classes and who was failing classes so that, that teachers could actually have strategic conversations with them to intervene in a timely fashion. So another important piece of this is that there's actually some research evidence that says if you improve, if you work on this indicator and there's movement, that you'll also see improvement in the outcome of interest. So in the case of the freshman on track indicator, we've seen really dramatic increases in freshman on track rates. So over the past 15 years, we've seen the freshman on track rate improve from the low 50s, and currently it's at 88%. So there'd be some really dramatic changes. And these have largely tracked to improvements in high school graduation. So that when we had, so at the same time, the students, like our current high school graduation rate is 74%. It used to be in the low 50s. When the most recent graduating high school class were freshmen, their on-track rate was 73%. So we've really seen that these improvements in freshmen on track are going along with these improvements in high school graduation. So this is kind of the causal evidence that would probably not impress economists, but for me, it really tells us that, you know, working on track can really make a difference. And so, I mean, through our work, we've really started to think about what makes for an effective indicator. We've got certain ideas about what this might be. So what I'm going to be asking you to do at your tables, there's a worksheet at the table. Each table has been assigned a different type of indicator. So I can go through this. So like, for example, table one, Table 1 has socio-emotional indicators, and what it's asking you to do is to look at these characteristics and say, so to what extent do I feel that there is a generalized set of support around socio-emotional indicators. To what extent is there evidence that socio-emotional indicators are predictive of outcomes that we really care about? And so what I'd like you to do is just sort of say, to what extent is there evidence? What are the areas of concern? And what are some comments? And then for about 5 minutes at the end, I'll be asking the tables to sort of report out on the places where they really see that there are gaps in the knowledge base of what we need to do to be working on those types of indicators. And I'm going to ask each table to have one person who's taking notes for the table and who will also be reporting out about this. So is that clear? Any questions on it? Okay, sounds good. All right, and okay, we're gonna get started. So each table had a different type of different class of next generation indicators. So why don't we start with the one that we heard about the most, socio-emotional learning. So there are, 3 tables or 4 tables that had socio-emotional learning. So I'm kind of curious, where do you see the gaps in what we know for socio-emotional learning indicators? Right here? Yeah, actually, are there mics? Sorry. We didn't coordinate our mic situation.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Tina Fernandez, and I'm the executive director of an organization called Achieve Atlanta in Atlanta, Georgia. And we talked a lot about social emotional indicators, and one of the gaps that we think still exists is just a information gap. There are people who know about this, people have been hearing about this. There are superintendents and school leaders who are getting a lot of information on social emotional learning, but that isn't necessarily trickling down to the people in the school building, to teachers, to principals, to community members. And there's also a real gap in understanding how do we teach these skills, right, and how do we effectively measure them. So there is a belief that there aren't good measurements for SEL competencies, and so if we can't measure it, how do we know if we're teaching it? Mm-hmm. There's not the professional development for the adults in the class or the families and communities to teach these skills, and quite frankly, a lot of people didn't learn them, growing up either. So it's hard to model and teach these skills when you don't have that training in and of itself. And then we just had a question about where do we think this is actually happening well, and we have a hypothesis that things like arts and sports and extracurricular activities are actually places where kids are learning SEL skills, but that explicit connection hasn't been made, and so and then we know that these activities are getting cut, especially for low-income kids. So we see lots of gaps.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent point, because I think one of the things, I have done a lot of work around social-emotional learning, and I've done a lot of presenting to after-school programs, and one of the things that's really interesting, contrasting that to school programs, is that the school people are kind of social-emotional learning. It seems kind of new and novel. It's next generation, but it's kind of the core of what out-of-school time people have been thinking about for a long time. And so the field of youth development is very, very well developed, but it hasn't really been the connection to what's going on in school and how that knowledge can be applied to the school setting is something that I think is definitely an area of growth, but it's a place where there is expertise that could really guide some of the work that we see now. And also early childhood is another area where people have been thinking about some of these things for a really long time. So does another one of the tables who is looking at social and emotional care too? Oh, way in back. Oh, back there?
Thank God you're tall. My name is Brian Richardson from UPD Consulting. A lot of the same points you talked about, we discussed as well, just a couple of other things that we mentioned. So I'm going to brag on the core districts. You didn't even mention it, but there's a set of dashboards that the California core districts have developed using a Tableau dashboard that I think are just really effective at helping you see some of the different relationships between socio-emotional learning and how it relates to all these different factors that we care about. And I have a copy. I actually carry around a copy in my bag because I think it's such a good example. But take a look if you haven't seen it. Some of the other things that we talked about are just that this is an emerging field, and so the specific things that you need to do if you see a certain pattern in these indicators is not totally broadly understood quite yet. And related to that, we talked about how I think some of us are working on scaling up new academic standards. Well, if there are a set of interventions or a set of practices that you're expected to scale across a whole district, scaling up those practices represents a massive change management problem that is not going to be easily solved, even if the right interventions are known. And anything else I missed, team? All right, I think that's it.
No, that's great. Thanks. I think it is one of the challenges around this is the question of, like, you mentioned how practices aren't necessarily known, but then even if we did know them, how do we actually make them much more widespread across schools? Okay, one more.
Okay, yeah. So we talked a little bit about, you were kind of starting to talk about scalability, but we talked about this idea of if we add in social and emotional learning, it gives us even more data points than we already have, and like how do we take these data points and make sense of them? And we kind of talked about this idea that we have them, but we're a little nervous that they might not be valid or accurate, and so then we don't use them or we don't know how to use them. So we just talked about how once we get them, how can we make it so that they're valid and accurate and they make sense to everybody, and then scale it up from there. And then lastly, just the idea of the next steps, like how can we make this tangible for schools, for teachers in the classrooms? Like what could we tell teachers to be able to do so they can start helping and supporting their students around these indicators?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's one of the transitions I think that we sort of saw with the early warning indicators is really starting to see data as a tool for improvement and really starting to understand what's happening with students. And it wasn't just an accountability measure alone, so it wasn't out there to embarrass you. But I think with the next generation indicators, they're a different type of indicators in many ways. And so I think we need to kind of understand how their use may be similar to the current practices and how their use may actually be different. Because in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do with these next generation indicators is tap into why it is that we're seeing what we're seeing with grades, attendance, and behaviors. Although we also care about them, but like how are these different systems related? So there's a lot of complexities here. Next group.
I think our group had very similar conversations to the other groups. There's just two things that I would add that we discussed that we didn't hear so much of. One is about really this chain. So we might have surveys or screeners that can identify certain at-risk factors in students, and we might have interventions that can lead to positive outcomes for kids, but the linking of all these things together we feel like is either missing or is not really accessible. So we don't know that we're really, when we apply this intervention, that we're getting to the root cause, or we don't know that we're really identifying the root cause for this intervention. So that's a piece where I think we're still, or we feel like we're just at the beginning of that right now, and that would be hugely helpful for schools and districts. The other is really what we call this. We had a lot of conversation about whether it's trauma-informed or social-emotional, but how that really brings people in or pushes them out of a conversation, and just the importance about that. So I would say those were the two things we'd add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really important consideration. I think the question of how do we link these different things, because it's not like we haven't, the social emotional side is probably the part that's new, but school climate surveys have been a long time. There's been health data for even longer. And so how do we actually start to make these talk to each other? And it sounds like, Bob mentioned in Baltimore, and there's different kinds of efforts that seem to be happening, but we're clearly have a long way to go. And how do we actually be really strategic and intentional about that? More? Okay.
All of the districts represented at the table were at least trying to take halting steps towards measuring these things. So thinking about which parts of these 5 elements of an effective indicator is maybe most difficult, generating the momentum behind work around an indicator and better understanding what is necessary to be able to accurately measure a construct and do work around it. There seemed to be at least interest as evidenced by people's actions to this point. Whether that interest would actually hold together when it's more like actually having to implement things and come to consensus on what things mean, and a little bit less like a Facebook like or something like that. We didn't get too into, but there was a lot of enthusiasm around the idea of these things as indicators.
Okay, excellent. Is that all of the social emotional learning? Okay, great. Let's move on to school climate. Volunteer to go first? I also have a list, so I can always cold call a table, so.
All right. Daniel Leland, DC Public Schools. We talked about the gap really being the link or making the link more explicit between school climate and post-secondary outcomes. We understood that school climate is very important to making sure that students feel welcome, safe, and want to attend school. And then once we get them there, we can educate them. But how does that really match up with what we want them to do when they leave us and graduate from our K to 12 institutions? So that's what we talked about as being the gap. And I think there was another gap. And urban, rural, are those the same indicators?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think-
Is it different by geography?
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, one thing I was going to mention, I forgot to mention in my presentation. So I talked about the school climate survey that the consortium has been administering for over 25 years. Our partner organization, UChicago Impact, has been administering it across the state of Illinois, and I've lost track, but it's in like districts and states across the country. And one of the things that we started looking into is, like, to what extent are the relationships and the patterns that we see in Chicago the same in downstate Illinois? And largely they're similar, but I think it's an area where we really need to be doing a lot more work to understand, because schools are schools, but then there's also a lot of different things that are different in terms of who the kids are and what's actually happening inside of schools. I think one of the interesting things that we found was that the quality of instruction in many ways was better in the Chicago public schools than downstate, which I think came as a surprise to a lot of people. But on the other hand, there have been a lot of resources that have been given, a lot of PD and a lot of partner universities and organizations in the district to really be working on instructional practice in ways that rural districts don't. So I think there's some things that kind of that can be unearthed by this, where we see different patterns. And so it's really important to not just sort of say we have the magic indicator or survey instrument and apply it wherever.
Hi, I want to follow up on Daniel's first point and table one's first point about post-secondary, the link to post-secondary, because one of the questions here is to what extent is there evidence for the predictiveness of these indicators for on educational attainment? And I think that just the typical standardized test and how correlated are these, how predictive of it is, not the whole story, right? It's like once people are out in the workforce, there are other problems besides how much algebra and how much English they learned. And it's so hard to establish that link with post-secondary, and without an understanding, without having these kind of links to career and college outcomes, it's difficult to fully answer that question. And then the second thing I think that's interesting is just what people think about when they think about school climate. I heard one thing our friends in Philadelphia mentioned was looking at teacher retention as a measure of school climate, which is something that wasn't exactly on my radar, but I think that's a really probably one of the better indicators of adult behaviors that you can have within your school.
Yeah.
I'm one of his good friends from Philadelphia. We had a really great conversation about climates. I should pause. I'm an assistant superintendent in Philadelphia. We measure climate in our school progress report. One of the gaps in the problem is the data comes out in January from the preceding school year. So even if qualitatively we will say that school is a mess, we don't have the actual data to support that school is a mess until we've started the next school year. So like our ability to intervene, to make a decision, to change a leader, like the whole host of options were significantly delayed by 6 months. And saying that, but saying we are further along than we've ever been, right? So acknowledging that we have a delay, but we've come so far. And then I think this conversation around what is climate, like what are the indicators? Because in an urban environment, we're like, are the kids fighting? Did the kids drop out?
Right.
And those are not the questions we're starting to ask. We're asking about teacher retention, and we're asking about, is your school clean? Are children welcomed when they arrive in the morning? How often do teachers call home? And so shifting the responsibility of a climate from kids who will rise or fall to any expectation we set for them to adults and how do we hold the adults accountable? And so, like, writing teachers and principals up on climate issues and not the things you would observe in an instruction. So I'm in your building, I watched you walk past a pile of trash. You did not call maintenance, you did not pick it up yourself. You did nothing to improve the environment, and holding like facility managers accountable. So showing up at a building on Monday morning and it's dirty, we pay you a lot of money to keep the building clean. And that has been a huge kind of mindset shift around, like, I don't care, like I have some of my schools in some of the most impoverished parts of the city. I literally don't care about what the corners around the building look like, but when we walk inside this school, is it clean? How do kids know that they're welcome? And it's a shift in climate that I don't think we had in previous years, but it's dramatically improved how students are behaving inside that environment, because they will protect their school. Like, you will watch a kid not litter in front of their school and then go across the street and throw something, and you're like, no, we don't litter at all. But it's interesting to see how kids are like, you know, no, we don't touch the bulletin boards because she's crazy. And helping them rethink what their space is, even in the midst of extreme poverty or situations that we tend to feel sorry for kids for, when we actually could just make the environment that they exist in better.
You know, I think it's a great point. I think the timeliness piece of this too is like really interesting, because I think there are some things like school climate in some ways takes a long time to change, but on the other hand, there's these small indicators that can actually tell you that some policy or things that you've done can actually have an effect really, really quickly. And actually on the school, I was going to do a quick shout out to one of our reports. We actually have done research on the relationship between school climate and teacher retention. And there is, I mean, no one is surprised by this at all, but there is a lot of evidence that school climate really shapes whether or not teachers are going to stay in a school or leave. Okay, one more? Okay. Great.
I got nominated to share. Like one of the other groups, I mean, climate is huge, right? So, you know, coming up with a definition for climate, maybe a district by district or school by school endeavor, although there's some core things that you would want to see. And, you know, we were talking about the known strategies, practices, and interventions. And, you know, depending on what part of the school, what element of school climate you're talking about, there are, you know, if you want to improve communication, there's plenty of proof. Or if you want to improve discipline in the way kids treat each other, there's, you know, those things are there. They take a long time sometimes. Right. Some are shorter terms. Some things are longer terms. But then we have to have measures of the fidelity of the implementation of the things we think are going to change. And at least in my district, that's where we really fall down.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks. I think, is that all of our school climate groups? Okay, so let's move on to health. Who wants to start with health? I know, you already spoke, but you wanted to start. I know, that was pure coincidence. Yay! You got a ringer at that table. But no. I know, that was...
Not accepted, but thank you. The consensus, it was a great discussion that we had here, and the consensus was that, you know, there's information out there, but it's not necessarily common knowledge to people who are working in schools, designing programs, working on indicators in the education sector, that it's either not information that they have, or the health issues aren't high up on their list of priorities, and that there's some lack of awareness of the connection, and that if there were more awareness of that connection and of the impact on outcomes like attendance that are really important to the people running the schools and the education system, that it might rise higher to the priority list. There was also a discussion of, you know, gaps in awareness of impact, and then gaps in capacity to, even if you have that information, to use that, whether it's, do screenings in your own school, or if you screen kids, once you find kids with issues, how do you even deal with that? Do you have 5 case managers? Probably not. What are the health resources in your area? Do you even know? Do you have the capacity to do what you need to do to know or build those relationships? So that being a big gap of capacity to identify or respond. And then the gap in sharing of information in the appropriate ways. So a nurse might know who asthmatics are, but the teachers with those kids in their classes might not know, or the information that a pediatrician might have that's really relevant, but that the school doesn't have, or the school with the absenteeism information that the health sector doesn't have. So definitely some gaps there.
Okay, great, excellent, thank you. And it's a little hard act to follow up, but next on health. Yay!
Hello. So we had the health indicators as well, and we were kind of thinking that there was a couple of different ideas that a lot of the schools aren't equipped right now to be able to provide the interventions, and if they were, maybe there would be more support for adding these types of indicators. In general, it seemed like it would be a very good idea, but there's some definite HIPAA regulations that make it hard to share that data across the different silos of data that we have available. And then another thing that a lot of the folks here at the table have worked with community schools or wraparound services, and that's definitely something that they would like to look at, but those resources aren't available in every school necessarily. It definitely seems like there would be a benefit for the kids to not have to miss class if there was a school or a trailer of some sort that could come and they could do their doctor's visit there. And also a benefit to the community for being less expensive, but there's just some barriers as far as those regulations of how we share data that haven't been addressed so far. Are there other things that we... Right.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you.
What they said? It took 5 minutes to figure out we have a bunch of doctors at this table, but none of us are the type that actually all kidding on the Lord side. A couple things just to add. It's interesting we talk about it from a higher ed perspective, but they actually have on-site resources. In terms of clinics and whatnot. Yet, when you got 51, almost 70, and the crazy numbers at ASU, this idea of kind of how to collect that information and then direct the services is kind of an impossible task on many levels, but considering you're dealing with adults and not children in the K-12 system. But then within the K-12 system, some of the assumptions that we talked about, and certainly the assumption that I make, is that at the elementary level, there's probably greater information that's flowing already. Just the nature of the interactions between families and parents. The fact that teachers generally see their kids for 5, 6, 7 hours. So when there's something that's pressing from a medical perspective, a mental health perspective, a family issue, et cetera, it becomes known quicker than in the secondary system. And so that was just one of the conversations we had is how do you gather the right kind of information? We were different and all of that. But even so, then the so what becomes really important. And thinking about the system implications in terms of elementary, the high, and the secondary space.
Yeah, those are great points. I think is there one more health group, or are we all set?
So, again, a doctor of the intellect, not an actual medical doctor like my uncle and dad. So ditto what everyone said. We identified the same gaps in terms of a disconnect between practitioners and policymakers in the education sector and an understanding of the health indicators and their relationships with academic attainment. And I think that a starting point that I'm more knowledgeable about, because I am a former teacher and a former faculty member in higher ed who now collaborates with schools via a nonprofit organization, is that attendance works as far as identifying a starting point for the research and the indicator of chronic absenteeism in particular. consisting of both excused and unexcused attendance that you were referring to. I think Attendance Works has done some exploring and probably some actual research on the causal relationship between chronic absenteeism and chronic health issues. So I would say that's just a good place to start as like a base and maybe a template for looking into other health indicators.
Great, thanks. So is that all groups, or is it one more comment from Sarah?
Collective impact sometimes
Oh, right.
combines the different types of indicators. So collective impact might be another place that you might look for this kind of merging of the health indicators with the education indicators.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you, so much for your collective brain power. We're actually going to be collecting the sheets that you have so we can be using that as sort of fodder for our work group going forward. So all your ideas will not be lost. So really appreciate it. And I guess I'm the thing that's keeping you from your snacks. So there are snacks outside. I heard the cookies are amazing. So feel free to take a break for how long? So it'll be a 10-minute break, and then we will move on to response systems. So thank you so much.